Nice to see you all on this Saturday. We've been in the book of Hebrews for a long time, but only 2 more weeks. Somebody was asking me that, and we'll be kind of wrapping this up. So I'll say more about what's coming next at the end of the service tonight. Our passage today begins with a simple command. Can I get this up here? It's a call to love one another. Hebrews 13:1, let brotherly love continue. Now, when we start that, some people say, okay, when you get to chapter 13 of Hebrews, he's just finished everything he's going to say about what he really wants to talk about, but now he's got a few miscellaneous things that didn't fit anywhere, or, practical suggestions, a little list. And I don't think it kind of flows quite that way. And so I want to talk a little bit about why in the world this would immediately follow something that just seems to fit it so poorly, where it says, our God is a consuming fire. And then he says, now I want you to love each other. Fire is a warm image, for sure, but not the kind that tends to make everyone glow with affection for each other. A campfire is way different from a consuming one. And that made me search the previous verses for some sort of link. And before we push forward in today's text, I'd like to suggest some connections, and one in particular, between where we've been and where he's taking us today as we launch into Hebrews chapter 13. And it's going to give us, I think, a better handle on how strategic this passage is for the unshakable kingdom of God. Now, first of all, I was thinking that love, let's define it a little bit. Love as an other-focused life, where the needs and well-being of other people are put ahead of your own. And so I was thinking that love has not been out of the picture completely in chapter 12, because we did get that. Because if you're running the race, you got to make sure that you realize other people are running with you. So in chapter 12, verse 15, he cautioned us to watch out for each other, lest anyone miss out on God's grace. Because it's not enough just that I finish well. I need to help other people. So you're not in this race alone. And certainly that's love in action. But that didn't help me much with the consuming fire disconnect. And so the more I read through the passage from last week, I realized that the real link between God's wrath and our love is what I'll call humility. So I just want you to think about that as we kind of prepare our hearts for this passage. Consider that the consuming wrath of God could and should have fallen on me, a proud, filthy sinner, but fell instead on the perfect Son who took my place. And that pretty much knocks the pride out of me. And that's the frame of mind then that you have to have in order to prioritize the needs and welfare of other people ahead of your own, what we call brotherly love. And so I want you to consider humility as the necessary link between chapter 12, now getting into chapter 13, even though the word humility isn't used. The connection between fearing a fiery God and loving each other selflessly rises from this complete humbling that comes from what we learned in the text last week. Let me say a little more about that. When the preacher got to verse 28, so I put that up there along with verse 29, he stressed how grateful we should be that through Christ we have inherited an unshakable kingdom. Look how it says that. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Otherwise, if we don't have that kingdom, then what we've got is going to be shaken to pieces and incinerated when the end comes. Now, when it says, let us be grateful, that literally says, let us have grace. It's an idiom for gratitude, but it immediately contrasts with what we had earlier in verse 15, where it says, be careful, somebody's going to fall short of the grace of God. So grace, let's say this, is God blessing you when you don't deserve it, but then gratitude is you humbly receiving his blessings in full knowledge that you don't deserve even one of them and could never have gotten where you are without divine help. And so then, according to verse 28, gratitude is supposed to result in acceptable worship and service of God. Look at it where it says, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship, which could also be translated service, with reverence and awe. So this is where you are completely available for God's agenda, the amazing God. And God's kingdom, that amazing, unshakable kingdom, having come to realize that building your own thing is foolish. It's all going to burn. And so you have to build on something that's going to remain. And so he starts this and he says, let brotherly love remain. It's the same word that he gave us at the end of verse 27. Actually, it's not up there. And so here it is. What we're going to get in chapter 13, at the core of this lasting, unshakable kingdom, is first of all, love that flows out of a humbled, blessed, thoroughly loved heart. Now, we get to 6 verses about love, which together describe a life investment that will not burn up when all is shaken. And the first one is this general command in verse 1, let brotherly love continue. Now, when it says let, it doesn't mean just permit it. It means to work on this. Do whatever you have to make sure that brotherly love continues, remains, lasts, endures. Now, the preacher knows they already love each other, so he says let it continue. But it's a little stronger than just kind of let it continue. It says build on this. This is really what we want to see remaining for this unshakable kingdom. He wants them to see love as an essential, foundational ingredient in the unshakable kingdom. So don't let love for each other fade. This love is a gift of God's grace to you. It's a mark, in fact, of genuine faith. And I could illustrate that from all over the New Testament, that someone who claims to be a Christian but does not love his brother is a fake. 1 John is the best example of it. So it's not that you have complete love. You don't need to grow in it. But it's like Paul told the Thessalonian Christians, 1 Thessalonians 4, 9, and 10, now concerning brotherly love, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. This is part of the whole faith package. For that indeed is what you are doing, but we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more. So, brotherly love. Brotherly love is family love. Brother, see, that's a family word. It's an obligation that was actually very common in the Roman world. You were expected to take care of the brothers in your household. But you had no obligation to love those outside your natural family, actually not even your own sisters. And that was kind of weird when I read that. Well, because I only had 2 sisters, I didn't have a brother, so I'd be off the hook on this one. Anyway, well, this Christian notion of actually loving people that weren't even in your family was considered ludicrous by the pagans around them. But ludicrous or not, the Christian obligation is much larger. And I'm calling this verse actually like this: when God expands your family. In fact, he doesn't enlarge it just a little at a time, like let's say the Corley clan. They only had 2 babies this week. God adopts people by the millions, and he orders you to love this large bunch of people as if they were your actual brothers. A spiritual family based on having the same spiritual daddy who has given us life, and also based on this eternal connection we have with the same brother, Jesus Christ. Well, like all families then, we share the same heritage, we have the same inheritance, but it's also like a family in this way. You can't choose, well, put it this way, although you can choose your friends, you cannot choose your brothers and sisters. They're handed to you without a vote. You are obligated, commanded to learn to love them. Now, I had 2 wonderful sisters, but I can't remember getting a choice in the matter. And nor did they. So there were 2 sisters. I think they wanted another sister. Although one of them was younger than me, but let's just imagine them getting a vote. They would have voted for another girl, I think. So one was named Faith and one was named Joy, and I think they lost hope when they had me. Anyway, now, I would have chosen sisters if I knew that they would do all of my chores and worship me. But they didn't happen to be like that. So let's think of this in the same way. God's children are chosen by him, not you, and they become your brothers and sisters. And to put it mildly, that is a stretch. He expects you to love people you would never have chosen with your high standards and your impeccable discernment and your lust for servants who love nothing more than to make life easier for you. The writer and NPR commentator Heather King was a recovering alcoholic. She came to faith in Christ and was reflecting on her initial experience with the church. She said, "My first impulse was to think, my God, I don't want to get sober with these nutcases. Or in the case of the church, worship with these nutcases. Or boring people, or people with different politics, taste in music, food, books, or whatever. Nothing shatters our egos like worshiping with people we did not handpick. The humiliation of discovering that we are thrown in with extremely unpromising people, people who are broken, misguided, wishy-washy, out for themselves, people who are us. But we don't come to church to be with people who are like us in the way we want them to be, she writes. We come because we have staked our souls on the fact that Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, and the church is the best place, the only place to be, while we all struggle to figure out what that means. We come together, well, we come because we'd be hard-pressed to say which is the bigger of the two scandals of God, that he loves me or that he loves everyone else. Now, love like this requires a lot of humility because love constantly makes demands on us. It costs us. It can feel draining to be in this family, and we can be used. We can be put upon because love always puts the needs of the other person ahead of our own, even when it's not convenient, even when our own needs get unmet because they don't reciprocate, and even when people are ungrateful. We resist this because natural pride says, I come first, I will not be overlooked. And humility says, they come first, and God will look after me. Nothing is farther from the old nature we got from Adam and Eve. So let's talk about a little bit, and this I could have put this in the introduction a little more, but let's talk about the curse of narcissism. Narcissism, me first. It's a modern epidemic, even though it started at the fall of man. I was thinking of naming this sermon, Getting Over Yourself, or Humility in an Age of Selfies. I was going to have my phone up here and do a little selfie, but I never know which side of the camera to actually, or a phone to actually aim at myself, since I've never taken one. Anyway, well, this age has no valuable place for selfless love anymore. My Facebook page, if I had one, would be expected to contain glamorous or self-promoting pictures of myself. Because life today is about me, my kingdom, and how everything is going for me, and how everyone thinks of me, and what they think of me. And there's not a whole lot of energy coming from the surrounding culture pushing me to rejoice with those that rejoice or weep with those who weep. Researchers have discovered that 80% of talk that is done on Twitter and Facebook is about yourself, because subconsciously, they've discovered, your brain says that feels good. They've also discovered that today's college students are far more self-centered than their predecessors. From 1982, that's a ways back, and up to 2006, over 16,000 college students completed an evaluation called the Narcissistic Personality Inventory. The standard inventory asks rated responses to statements such as, if I ruled the world, it would be a better place. What do you think of that? I think I am a special person. I can live my life the way I want to. Now, the nationwide results that are most recent are quite startling and did not bode well for having a loving society. It looked more like we were getting a runaway majority of people who thought that the world would be much better off if it revolved around me, M-E, the kingdom of me. Now, one of the researchers said, and remember, another decade has elapsed since this study, we need to stop endlessly repeating you're special and having children repeat that back. Kids are self-centered enough already. So why do we teach preschoolers to sing, I am special, look at me, look at me? Oh, my goodness. And so they trace this back to, well, they say narcissists are more likely to have romantic relationships that are short-lived, at risk for infidelity, lack emotional warmth, and to exhibit game-playing dishonesty and over-controlling and violent behaviors. Those are not all good things. And, of course, it goes back to the dawn of the self-esteem movement that began mostly in the 1980s. And then if you add current technology, that also fuels the increase in narcissism. Think about Facebook and what they call MySpace and the constant ego massage you get from your cell phone, even when it's not on vibrate. So, David Brooks, New York Times, he said, commencement speakers are always telling young people to follow their passions. Be true to yourself. This is a vision of life that begins with self and ends with self. But people on the road to character growth do not find their vocations by asking, what do I want from life? They ask, what is life asking of me? Sounds a little bit like John F. Kennedy. How can I match my intrinsic talent with one of the world's deep needs? I mean, that would be a way of saying, what's a way of loving? And it's not that people like it when other people are egocentric. They just don't see it in themselves. They would hate to be labeled self-centered by other people. And yet 71% of millennials thought that millennials are too selfish, just not them. I'm okay, you're selfish was an article in the New York Times Magazine in 2015. Surprise, people don't like to be around selfish people who talk about themselves constantly. But times have changed us in subtle ways. C.S. Lewis began his famous sermon, Weight of Glory, by remarking that, here's the quotation, the very first words of the sermon, if you ask 20 good men today what they thought the highest of the virtues, 19 of them would reply unselfishness. But if you asked almost any of the great Christians of old, he would have replied love. You see what has happened? A negative term has been substituted for a positive, and this is more than philosophical importance. The negative ideal of unselfishness carries with it the suggestion not merely of securing good things for others, but of going without them ourselves, as if our abstinence and not their happiness was the important point. I do not think this is the Christian virtue of love. Now, this was 1941. Now, so let's recognize an important distinction, that love is a focus not in any way on ourselves, but on the well-being of another real flesh and blood person made in God's image. This is not, I love the whole world, but it's people I can't stand. This is actually loving a real person, perhaps a suffering person, and perhaps a very unworthy and unlikable person, but someone who needs us and needs God. And this unfolds splendidly as we get into verses 2 and 3 of our chapter. But before we jump into that, a question for personal reflection. I'm going to have 6 of these, one for each point. You can scratch these down or not, because I'm going to rush past this pretty quick. But I say, do you have even one Christian on a hidden list under the heading, People I Refuse to Love? If so, then I have to wonder if you're not still clutching on to the fragile kingdom of me. Now, verse 2 says this, do not neglect or stop forgetting, and don't overlook or get passive about showing hospitality to strangers. Hospitality to strangers, that's actually just one word. Just as the Greek word for brotherly love is one word, Philadelphia. The Greek word hospitality is one word. Literally, don't neglect stranger love, philoxenia or xenia. You know, xenophobic has that in it too. The fear of strangers, or fear of Martians, I think. Anyway, and then the preacher gives you a motivation. For thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Now I'm calling this verse, when strangers need your stuff. Now, and I like putting it that way because I said, I don't really want to do that naturally. Now this is not at all talking about having guests over on a regular basis to eat your beans, what we call entertainment. There's nothing wrong with that. Have some people over to play a game or to just chat or even have a Bible study. It can be the sign of generous, other-centered hearts, and it's good for church when we spend together in home environments when we're not in our Sunday best. Home groups are some of the best opportunities for this. But the love here in Hebrews was something different, more demanding than that, really. It was a missional thing. And it was also risky love, because if you're in a town where Christianity is somewhat frowned upon, you don't necessarily want the traveling preachers holing up with you. Think about a guy named Jason, who was living quite normally in Thessalonica before Paul and his men showed up. This is Acts chapter 17. He opened his home. He ended up being hauled into court and paying money he had earmarked for his next meal. Now, stranger love in the early church was essential for traveling preachers as well as Christian business people, maybe especially for displaced refugees who had their homes taken from them. F.F. Bruce reminds us that inns, the Holiday Inn at that time in the Roman Empire, there were places of doubtful repute and indeed of positive danger. And we could add expensive. And so these travelers were people who would not normally be able to pay you or even reciprocate. Say, hey, next time you're in Iconium, stay at our place. Some of these travelers, such as Paul, didn't even have a home anywhere. They were dependent on generous people. John writes in 3 John 5 through 8, brothers, it's a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God, for they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles, literally the Gentiles meaning unbelievers. Therefore, we ought to support such people that we may be fellow workers for the truth. So, of course, our travel culture is very different now. But I think this call to hospitality means taking on a threefold mindset. Write these three down: a giver's mindset, a gospel mindset, and a God-expectant mindset. A giver's mindset. That means you don't play it safe with your stuff, but you make all you have available to God in his kingdom, the unshakable kingdom. And then it means a gospel mindset. It means you help out any way you can to get the gospel and its carriers where they need to go. And then a God-expectant mindset. It means you just might be helping out an angel, incognito, a plant from heaven, who is either testing you or bringing a blessing that you might never have received otherwise, be they human or angelic. So the background of that motivating statement at the end: for by showing hospitality, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Now it goes back to Genesis, I think you know that, where angelic visitors came to Abraham and then to Lot. They had a message to deliver. Angel means a messenger. And so some have suggested that this means that the act of hospitality at least means this, that it may end up being more of a blessing to the host than to the guest. We have found that true many, many times. It is certainly motivating to reflect on Jesus' words that when you help out one of his brothers, even with a cup of water, they don't have to be an angel, you have done it to the Lord himself. Matthew 25. So one way you can slam the door on the kingdom of me is to open your heart to strangers. Your humble worship and service will get stronger the more you invest in this unshakable kingdom. But now a second question. So you ready for this? Question 2, do you have little interest in that kind of investment? And you hold your stuff pretty close to your own vest. You don't want to spread it around, even if that means spreading the gospel. And then again, you should be wondering if you're not hanging on to the fragile kingdom of me. You know, at least I'm saved. Too bad for the rest of them. Now, travelers are not the only people that Christian love can help. And so verse 3 is about persecuted Christians who may or may not be in your own town. And so he says, remember those who are in prison. These are people who are in prison for their faith. And it might be easy to forget them, out of sight, out of mind, unless you recall that you, as Christ's followers, are united with them in life, whether good or bad. And so he says, as though in prison with them, literally, as fellow prisoners. Now, because of your faith, which is just like theirs, it could just as well have been you. And what if it had been you who had been arrested instead of them? Would you want to be forgotten? And those who are mistreated, he mentions, again, for their faith, maybe being harassed or beaten or having their belongings confiscated or losing their jobs. And again, a motivation is given toward empathy. He says, since, or as you are also in the body. Not the body of Christ, but the fact that you too have a physical body with nerve endings, the same possibilities of pain, and it could happen that you get beaten up someday because you follow Jesus. How would you want to be helped by your brothers? And so I call this whole section, when it could just as well be you. This is the golden rule applied to persecuted brothers and sisters. Now we know from chapter 10, verse 34, that these Hebrew Christians had in previous times shown their readiness to suffer sympathetically with prisoners. But you can't just write on the past, because persecution, more persecution, is on the way. So what are helpful things that they maybe did in the past and they could keep doing? Visit the prisoners, feed them. They weren't usually fed in those jails. Pay their bills while they can't work. Take care of their families, guard their homes. Post bail for them. Testify on their behalf. Could be many things. Do what Ed Banks calls carrying the burdens and wounds of other people and being outraged by them. You say, oh, well, ho-hum, Christians end up in jail sometimes. I mean, sometimes when I hear about some persecuted believers, let's say in North Korea or Turkey or some other place, I'm thinking, well, that's what always happens in those places, and it doesn't really get me the way I think it should. Be outraged. Or as Guthrie puts it, as if every blow they receive puts a stripe on your own back. That's what he's saying. No, all of that's risky love, because it means you're not hiding, like pretending you don't know those scoundrels. You're making yourself vulnerable, and that's love. That's Christ-inspired love. Now, of course, if these people live far away, you can at least pray for them with a heart for them, like the early church when they were praying for Peter when he was in jail. Imprisonment was not uncommon. Verse 23 talks about Timothy being only recently released from jail. Now, we've got millions of imprisoned people and mistreated brothers across the world. Now, some of them are in Turkey. Now, our Karen, who lives there in Izmir, recently forwarded a request that we pray for someone called Andrew Brunson, Pastor Andrew Brunson. You might write that word down. Brunson is Brunson. Now, he is in his 9th month in prison on false charges. He is in an overcrowded cell, elbow to elbow, with radical Muslims, day and night. And so the request is, pray that he will shine with the love of Christ and be constantly aware of Christ's presence with him. Also for God to uphold his wife and family. It is our privilege to join our hearts to those who suffer and not forget them. You might want to sign on to a couple of websites. OpenDoorsUSA.org is one of them. You might want to write that down. Or persecution.com. That's a little easier. That one's Voice of the Martyrs. And those sites will inform you and help you keep in mind those who are suffering so that you can pray for them, weep with those that weep, do whatever's appropriate. Now, when you identify with and maintain solidarity with persecuted Christians, this is another way that you undermine that fragile kingdom of me. Question 3. But what if you have little sympathy for those who are suffering in Jesus' name? Hey, as long as you and your family are okay. A 2-letter word is going to condemn you. M-E. Now, in verse 4, the preacher moves to a special, more exclusive expression of Christian love. What is shared between a man and a woman who are married? Potentially, this is the most powerful way to squelch the kingdom of me by giving yourself solemnly and exclusively to the lifelong welfare of another person, for better or worse. And so, it's marriage. Verse 4, let marriage be held in honor. Honor, meaning something that's precious, something that's treasured like gold, something that is not common but of high value. In fact, rare, because in our day, monogamy is an endangered species. Now, according to this command, we're supposed to promote a high view of marriage throughout the church. Let it be held in honor among all. Do all you can to guard one another's marriages, to promote a high view of marriage among singles who are considering it. It's not to be rushed into without counsel or handled casually. And it's to be among all implies that maybe some held a low view of marriage, either because they look down on marriage as less worthy for a Christian who ought to remain single, if possible, in order to serve God better, or more likely because of the next part, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. Look at another command. Now, a low view of marriage allowed someone to desecrate it by engaging in sexual activity with someone not their spouse, with a mistress or a prostitute, or by having an affair, even before marriage. All such activity defiled or figuratively made the marriage bed unclean. And so the preacher provides then a powerful motive for never treating your marriage that way, or anyone else's marriage. For God will judge the sexually immoral. Those would be those who commit sexual sins who are not married, and maybe even quite a variety of other sexual deviations, and adulterous, those who are not faithful to their vows. Now, it's very loving of God to warn us how seriously he takes this. At that time, marriage between pagans was so cheapened that there was no stigma when there were extramarital escapades. But Christians were supposed to be different. Why? Because of God's own viewpoint on marriage. They did not get their viewpoint from their culture. They had to get it from the viewpoint and attitude of God. And he, of course, invented marriage, and he invented sex, and he designed marriage and sex for his glory and for our good. Now, marriage must mean a lot to him if he condemns those who abuse it. So the verse ends with the word God in the emphatic position. Sort of like, for there is someone who will judge, and it is none other than God. So what you are doing may be legal where you live. Maybe not one of your neighbors or friends has any problem with your immoral behavior, but someone is watching who is wrathfully opposed to what you are doing. And it is his position and his opinion that ultimately matters, and only his. And his name is God. He is not a killjoy, but as John Piper puts it, he is opposed to all that kills joy. And that's what immorality of all sorts does. God is the main person in a marriage, even in the bedroom. Phil Griffin said, if you're sleeping with the person you're dating, you're telling each other two things. First, you're telling each other that your relationship with God is not your primary commitment. Second, you're telling each other that you are the kind of person that will sleep with someone you're not married to. Do you think that repeating vows to each other will somehow change that? It doesn't. You will enter into marriage if you end up marrying the person you're sleeping with, already telling each other that you will sleep with someone you're not married to. And so what happens when he goes on business trips or when she does the same and things come up? You already know that each of you is not first and foremost committed to God. Now, probably nothing brings out how me-centered we are than when we get married. Raise your hand if that happened to you. We discover our little selfish desires are not automatically met by this person who said, I do. Because his or her own selfish desires have to be thought about. And this shows up in the bedroom as well, where a me-first attitude is the surest way to kill romance and guarantee a lack of sexual harmony. I'm being pretty practical here, but anyway, we live in a time where there are incredibly high demands and expectations for sexual satisfaction with a sizzle, and it is all built on the kingdom of me. Now, if your expectations are unmet, the me marriage starts to fall apart. The big picture I get from this, and it is so practical, I call this verse, when commitment trumps feelings. Most people live with the false assumption that love, which they equate with warm, loving feelings, enables a marriage to survive, and that is not the case. It's just the opposite. Your love will not ensure your marriage will survive. It is your marriage, your vows, your commitment that sustains the love. It sustains it through the times when you don't feel it that much. And so your commitment to each other and to fidelity and to purity and to God will ensure your love can survive. And this is the very reason God ordained marriage. Pride is the great killer of marriage. I got to have what I want. What is the hardest word to pronounce in English? This was just on the internet this week, or at least it came up a couple of times. Words that are hard to pronounce in English. And I gave you a long list, including Antarctic, anemone. These are things often mispronounced. Asterisk, undoubtedly, sometimes comes out undoubtedly. Mischievous instead of mischievous. No, I think the hardest thing to say in English is actually a phrase or a couple of phrases that get stuck in your throat like a fishbone. If you're proud. How many are proud? I mean, we are. And so the hardest words to pronounce in English are, I was wrong and please forgive me. In humility. You have an opportunity every day to inspire and encourage your partner with your own humility. And that allows them to thrive and be their very best. But that will never happen until you treat your own selfishness more seriously than your spouse's selfishness. And he or she does have some. Now, you must also remember that this person you're married to is the only person on earth who can give you the blessing of a physical relationship without guilt. No other partner can do that. And so here's question number 4. Are you failing regularly to put the highest value on marital purity and fidelity? Now, I mean fidelity. That's not just not committing adultery. That's your commitment to work on your marriage, to meet the needs of your spouse, to bless your spouse, to fight for your marriage and the marriage of others, even if you're not married. And it's in fact, it includes what you watch and what you wear and how you think. I can't imagine, if you're failing to do that, I can't imagine a better way to make your kingdom fragile with a capital F, because it is faithless to do otherwise. The 5th verse calls out something you're not supposed to love if you're a Christian: money and all the things money can buy. Now, some guy said there are many things more important than money, and they all cost money. So the problem is that when you love things, you usually use people. So it is really, loving things is the death of real love. And so we get this in verse 5. This is such practical stuff. I love these 6 verses because it gets right down to this is how we have to live. So he says this, keep your life. This again is another command. Your life is your whole way of living and thinking, your whole approach, actually kind of your worldview. And by the way, this is again addressed to all the people in the church. They should influence each other to push back on the grip of greed and the pursuit of affluence. So keep your life free from love of money. Now we've had brother love and stranger love, and now we've got money love with a negative on the front of it. It's another one-word thing. Money love is a no-no. And it's just as toxic as a life of promiscuity, where what will satisfy me is what drives how I live each day and how I approach people and stuff. Self-gratification. Now, sexual impurity and greed are often coupled in the Bible, as in the 7th and 8th commandments happen to be side by side. So there's a positive side to this command. So he says, you don't want to love money, but be content with what you have. Now, contentment, that's not a passive thing. That is a heart that's building a heart of satisfaction with whatever God provides you. So it's not just complaining, I don't have more. It's actually looking what you have and saying, God, thank you. Taking joy in the fact that whatever God makes available for your needs is enough and it's good. And don't give way to greed or ungratefulness or complaining or worry or dishonesty. Because, if I just get that house over there, then I can finally be content. Now, once more, our preacher assigns a motivation, and this time from the words of God himself, recorded for all time in Deuteronomy 31, verse 6. Now, why should you be constantly satisfied and not worry over your finances? For or because he, God, actually, it says, he himself, like we have this promise from his own lips, this is on record. You can quote me on this, God says, has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. How many love this verse? Now, this is in the context of your finances, your greed, your discontent. And so you say, the Lord said to me, though, I'm sitting here, I'm worrying about paying the mortgage or wondering about this or that or struggling with some kind of greed. And I say, wait a minute, the Lord said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Now, the you in this statement is singular. I will never leave you, singular. Not just like if he's talking to the whole church. I will never leave your church. Like I will snuff out your candlestick like the Ephesian church in Revelation chapter 2. So, I will never leave you. Leave you, singular. Each person having the presence of the Lord, nor forsake you. Now, these are double negatives in Greek. And that doesn't turn them into a positive like we have in English. It means negatives on steroids. All right? A double negative is twice as negative. And so it's actually twice in this short promise, literally, no, not leave you, and no, not forsake you. I will never, ever leave you. I will never, ever forsake you. Now, leave can mean to set loose or to give up on or let go of something. Forsake means to abandon, desert, or walk out. And so I like this translation. I will never, ever let you go, and I will never, ever walk out on you. Now, I'm calling this when contentment is a person. Not a paycheck, not a promotion, not a pension, not a portfolio, not a porterhouse, not a pile of possessions, but a person. And there is no promise here that you will be rich, by the way, but only that you will be able to satisfy yourself with the presence of the God who will not have you go even through a season of lack without his constant presence. He will go through it with you. And as Paul testified about his ability to be content, even when times were lean, I've learned to be content when things are good, when things are bad, when I've got, when I don't got. And then he has this verse that's often applied in a very general way, but it was for that in particular, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Because without him, I can't do it. Without his help, if he's not there, I'm going to just be a complainer, a whiner, a wanter. I got to have more. I don't have enough. I'd be like Eve. God gave me all the trees in the garden, but I got to have that one extra one that he said I couldn't have. I can do all things, not through myself, but him who strengthens me, with him, with his help. So the Lord's presence gives you courage to rest contentedly in whatever you receive, not passively, We are required to work diligently and to be thrifty and to apply financial concepts like the things we learn in the Financial Peace University. I think we're going to do that in this coming year again. And so we remember, he who will not work should not be allowed to eat. He can't just say, I'm not working because the Lord is with me, so you can all feed me. Now, it's good to remember that for these readers, the loss of money could come through hospitality, supporting the persecuted, or having their own possessions taken away. And so they could avoid all that simply by dumping their faith. Now we come back to this. Don't turn back. Over the centuries, countless professed Christians have abandoned their walk because they realized that following Jesus was costing them more than they were willing to give up. But how can avoiding financial loss by dropping Christ possibly make up for the loss of God, who is always present to help you, like the shepherd of Psalm 23? The Lord is my shepherd, say it with me, I shall not want, I will not lack anything I truly need. And then later in the psalm, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, because why? You are with me. I will never leave you or forsake you. Now, there's a lot of ways to examine our hearts and deal with that. But I remember something that C.S. Lewis wrote, and he had this right. He confessed, he who has God in everything has no more than he who has God alone. Now, the love of money and fear-based discontent amounts to accusing God of incompetence as our provider. Those who live for money and self are saying, I can't trust God to take care of me. And so pride and fear set up money on a throne, like a rival god, another master. And that's why Paul calls all greed idolatry. It is another god. This is perhaps the clearest evidence that you are depending on a shadow kingdom, one that will crumble like a foolish man's house when the flood comes. Question number 5. What are you actually depending on for security when times are hard? Your shekels or your shepherd? And this is exactly where the preacher takes us as he wraps up these love exhortations by quoting another psalm, Psalm 118. This is the faithful response to the promise of verse 5. And so he says, therefore, you could translate, but because remember we have a series of therefores throughout this latter part of the book. Therefore, based on that promise, this is where faith always feeds on God's promises, we can confidently, boldly, with complete conviction, make this boast. Now, narcissists are always boasting about something, and this is the boast of the recovering narcissist. Can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. Not that the Lord is a helper, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? And the word man, just like the word God came at the end in one of the other verses, the word man comes at the very end. So it's like this. What can someone do to me? Someone who is a mere man. When I have the Lord Almighty as my helper. I'm calling this when fear is cast out by perfect love. God's help comes out of his deep love for you. I use the words like this because I want you to import 1 John chapter 4 into this. We love because he first loved us. We say, how do we do these 5 kinds of loving? When we come to the 6th verse, we find out it's with his help. He has to love us first. And all the supposed love from you for difficult brothers, for prisoners, for a difficult spouse, is an absurd agenda if it's all up to you. It has to start from this deep well of the love of God for you, a grace that he has given you. And then it says, perfect love casts out fear. So fear is that great crippler of Christian love, fear that I am not going to get what is due me if I stretch out and I prioritize the needs of others. I've got to make sure that I get what I get first, or what I need. Now, fear floods in whenever faith fails to lay hold on the promises of God, like the promise that he will never leave us or forsake us. But faith says humbly, I need help. And I have it from you, my God, who will not break his promise. I boldly confess, God is my helper because he himself said he would be. Now, I have to interject something that C.S. Lewis said about God's help before I go too far, because somebody will say, God's my helper, so, man, I need help getting that big house, and so he's going to help me do that. No. You need to know what God is going to help you do and what he won't. And so C.S. Lewis writes this, he says, Christ says, give me all. Now, so don't get from me, give me all. I don't want so much of your time and so much of your money and so much of your work. I want you. I have not come to torment your natural self, but to kill it. No half measures are any good. I don't want to cut off a branch here and a branch there. I want to have the whole tree down. I don't want to drill the tooth or crown it or stop it, but have it out. Hand over the whole natural self, all the desires which you think are innocent as well as the ones you think are wicked. This is the whole me kingdom. The whole outfit, he says, and I will give you a new self instead. In fact, I will give you myself. And this was our dear friend sitting in the 5th row said when she heard, what preacher was this? Alan Redpath was talking about it. As soon as you pray, your kingdom come, you have just put your kingdom down. You have to give up on yours. So, this is the help he will give you. He will help you die so he can make you live and make you love. He will break you so you can be whole. So how are you going to relentlessly love your imperfect, highly irregular Christian brothers and sisters? Meeting their needs above your own, even when it's not convenient and unappreciated. Where do you get the heart to regularly open your home and heart to strangers and help out your imprisoned brothers and anyone else who is mistreated for their faith? Risky, expensive acts of self-giving. Where do you get the strength to express wholesome love in your marriage, even sexually, as an honor to God and your spouse and to marriage itself? How do you stand against the tide of our whole culture and your old heart and actually reject the love of money and be satisfied with whatever God makes available? Not one of those love actions is possible without taking completely to heart the verses at the end. Love like this is possible only with the presence and the help of the living God, who happens to also be the loving God. He will happily make lovers out of us if we start with the humility of gratitude and dependent faith, but only if we let him kill our natural self and live out his heart through us. So think about this. You will always have a high-maintenance, low-harmony marriage until one of you and then both experience the kind of brokenness that has died to self-satisfaction, like Jesus hanging on the cross. There is no way to resist the pull of the money god with all of its worries and distractions of mere things until you place yourself on the altar of self-sacrifice and let Christ kill you so he can resurrect you. And there is no way that you will stop being a sexual atheist. Someone who says they believe in an almighty creator but then acts as if God had nothing of consequence to tell you or provide for you in the area of sexual expression until you're convinced that God created you for his ultimate pleasure and the pleasure of his constant presence. But you'll have to die to get that. Hey, look, it's really hard to feel his loving hand on your shoulder while you were stubbornly doing the very thing he died to save you from. Statement from John Piper. So you can't love like this without supernatural help, because the kingdom of me, though fragile, is a great deceiver. And few can escape its grip until it's too late. And yet how desperately this world needs to see someone stand up in righteous love in a world full of hate and revenge and indifference and selfishness, saturated with sensuality and the spirit of acquisition and broken relationships, where people are worried and insecure and they're grasping onto the fragile little kingdoms of me that will all be shaken. So confess where your help comes from. We need constant reminders of this and even rebukes. Quote these verses at the end when you are tempted to lust, or tempted to covet, or tempted to be indifferent to someone you're supposed to love. The Lord says, I will never leave you or forsake you. The Lord is my help. Why am I afraid? What is man going to do to me? Or as Paul says it, if God is for us, who can be against us? John Ortberg loves to tell this story about what happened many years ago as he was walking in Newport Beach, a beach in Southern California. He was with two friends, and he writes, I'm sure I've told this before, but let's hope it's at least 10 years ago. Anyway, two of us were on staff together at a church, and one was an elder at the same church. We walked past a bar where a fight had been going on inside. The fight had spilled out on the street, just like an old Western. Several guys were beating up on another guy, and he was bleeding from the forehead. We knew we had to do something, so we went over to break up the fight. I don't think we were very intimidating. All we did was walk over and say, "Hey, you guys, cut that out." It didn't do much good. And then all of a sudden, they looked at us with fear in their eyes. The guys who had been beaten up, the one guy stopped and started to slink away. And I didn't know why until we turned and looked behind us. And out of the bar had come the biggest man I had ever seen. He was something like 6'7", maybe 300 pounds, maybe 2% body fat, just huge. And we called him Bubba. I mean, not to his face, but afterwards when we talked about him. Bubba didn't say a word. He just stood there and flexed. Why am I doing that? Like that's going to impress you, like, oh, you're really getting into the part. Anyway, you could tell he was hoping that they would try and have a go at him. And all of a sudden, my attitude was transformed. And I said to those guys, "You better not let us catch you coming over here again." And Ortberg says, I was a different person because I had a great big Bubba. I was ready to confront with resolve and firmness. I was released from anxiety and fear. I was filled with boldness and confidence. I was ready to help somebody that needed helping. I was ready to serve where serving was required. Why? Because I had a great big Bubba. I was convinced I was not alone. I was safe. You don't have to wonder whether or not he'll show up. He's always there. You know, I will never leave you or forsake you. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to live your life in hiding. You have a great big God, and he's called you to do something. So get on with it. If God is for us, who can be against us? What can man do to me? A lot, actually, and plenty that is painful. We had that in chapter 11. We had people who were even sawn in two because of their faith. But here's what this means. They can throw you in prison, but there are some things you need never fear from man. Man can never separate you from the love of God. That's one. And we could go to passages on all of these. Two, man can never keep you from experiencing personal growth and outrageous peace in the midst of your sufferings. I mean, they can torment you, but they can't change this. Three, man can never stop you from praying to the Lord, who will never let you go, and he will never walk away. And then four, man can never rob you of eternal joy. Joy in God's presence in an everlasting kingdom that cannot be shaken. So, final question. Do you trust God for these promises or don't you? Simple question. But if you don't, then you are trusting in something else, very fragile, that is going to get wiped out, and you with it. Come to Jesus before it's too late. Let's pray. It is our great blessing, Lord, to hear the promise that you will not leave us or forsake us. We bow our hearts before you. As we worship you, we know you are here. And we think of the challenges of love that we've talked about. I think about that part of the song, Abide With Me. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. We confess we need you. We cannot be the loving congregation, the loving parents, the loving children, loving spouses, loving prayer warriors, loving aiders of our friends when they are in trouble or when they need encouragement or they need someone just to laugh with them because something great happened. We'll all fail at that without your present wonderful help. So thank you that you're there for us. Lord, you are our helper. We do not need to fear what man will do to us. In Jesus' name.